That night, when my neighbor knocked on my door, I had no idea what to expect. But it turned out to be the beginning of one of the craziest and most unforgettable nights of my life. It had started as an ordinary evening. My husband, Arthur, was away on another one of his frequent business trips, leaving me alone in a house that felt far too big when empty. The kids were away with friends for the weekend, and the silence seemed almost oppressive. The faint flicker of the TV in the corner added a muted hum of background noise, but it was no comfort. I barely registered the scenes playing on the screen. Scrolling aimlessly through my phone didn't help either. The endless stream of updates and notifications only served to deepen the hollowness I felt. I was alone again, another Friday night stretching ahead, lifeless and uneventful. Then came the knock. It was sharp, deliberate, and loud enough to break through the monotonous hum of my quiet evening. My heart leapt, startled by the unexpected sound. I wasn't expecting anyone. For a moment I hesitated, glancing toward the front door. Curiosity mingled with unease as I stood, brushing my hands over my jeans and making my way across the hardwood floor. Through the peephole I saw him. Richard. He stood there on my porch, hands shoved in the pockets of his jeans. His brow was furrowed, his expression one of concern, though there was something else in his eyes that I couldn't quite decipher. He looked effortlessly casual, as always, his lean frame clad in a simple t-shirt and jeans, his dark hair slightly tousled in a way that seemed both careless and deliberate. I opened the door, mustering a polite smile to mask the sudden awareness stirring in my chest. "Hey, Richard," I greeted, trying to sound casual. "Everything okay?" His eyes met mine, warm and yet guarded, with a flicker of something unspoken behind them. His voice, a low rumble, sent a shiver down my spine. "Hey, Clara. Sorry to bother you so late. I was wondering if you had, well, a wrench." He shifted slightly, a gesture so subtle and yet disarming, making him seem boyish despite his tall frame. "A wrench," I repeated, chuckling softly. "What kind of trouble are you getting yourself into?" He laughed too, running a hand through his hair in a way that made my stomach flip unexpectedly. "Sink trouble. It's acting up and I can't fix it. I thought maybe Arthur might have something I could borrow." "Sure," I said, stepping aside and gesturing for him to come in. "Arthur keeps a toolbox in the garage. Let me grab it for you." He hesitated briefly, then stepped inside, bringing a gust of cool night air with him. As he brushed past me, his shoulder barely grazed mine, a fleeting contact that left a spark in its wake. I told myself I was imagining it. The garage felt smaller with Richard standing there, his presence filling the space in a way I wasn't prepared for. The scent of motor oil mingled with his cologne, creating a strange mix that made my senses feel unusually heightened. I focused on the task at hand, crouching down to sift through the toolbox, but I could feel his gaze on me, lingering just a second too long. "So," I said, forcing a casual tone to break the spell, "what exactly is the problem with your sink?" He chuckled softly. "It's sputtering like crazy. I've tried tightening the pipes, but I'm pretty sure I'm making it worse." I found the wrench and held it out to him, my fingers brushing against his as he took it. The contact was brief, almost accidental, but it sent a jolt of electricity through me. I looked up to find him watching me, his eyes darker than before, filled with an intensity one couldn't name. "Thanks," he said, his voice quieter now. "I really appreciate this." "It's no problem," I replied, but my voice came out softer than I intended. The silence stretched between us, thick and heavy. His gaze lingered, and I became acutely aware of how close he was, closer than he needed to be. "Do you want me to take a look?" I heard myself ask, surprising even me. "I mean, I'm no plumber, but I might be able to help." Richard tilted his head, a small, appreciative smile playing at the corners of his lips. "You don't have to," he said, but there was a note of something hope in his tone. "I don't mind," I said quickly, feeling the heat rise to my cheeks. "Lead the way." The walk to his apartment felt longer than it should have. The night air was crisp, and the sound of our footsteps echoed softly on the pavement. I tried to focus on the conversation, on the task ahead, but I couldn't ignore the way his cologne lingered in the air or the warmth of his presence beside me. His apartment was small but tidy, a stark contrast to my chaotic, family-filled home. The living room was modestly furnished, with clean lines and a distinct sense of style. I noticed the posters on the walls, bands, movies, details that gave me a glimpse into his life. "It's just the bathroom," he said, gesturing down the hallway. The bathroom was even smaller, its confines bringing us closer than I anticipated. The scent of soap and damp tile filled the air, mingling with the faint trace of his cologne. The sink sputtered softly, its rhythmic gurgling mirroring the nervous flutter in my chest. I crouched down, examining the pipes, while Richard hovered nearby. Each time our arms brushed, a thrill shot through me that I struggled to ignore. "It doesn't look too serious," I said, my voice strained as I reached for the wrench. Our fingers brushed again, and this time, neither of us moved away immediately. Richard's gaze met mine, intense and unguarded. The space between us felt charged, the air thick with something unspoken. "Thanks, Clara," he murmured, his voice softer now. He stepped closer, closer than he needed to, and I felt the heat of his body, the tension radiating off him like a current. For a moment, I forgot to breathe. "It's nothing," I managed to say, but even to my own ears, the words sounded hollow. As I tightened the final bolt, my heart raced, and I couldn't ignore the undeniable pull between us. The boundaries I had always relied on felt blurry, and I knew, deep down, that the night wasn't over. Something was brewing beneath the surface, something that would change everything. "I've been thinking about this all night," Richard said, his voice barely above a whisper. His eyes locked onto mine, the vulnerability in their depths mingling with an unrelenting determination. About you." The words hung heavy in the air between us, a confession that felt both dangerous and inevitable. My breath caught in my throat, my mind reeling from the weight of his admission. I don't know what to say," I stammered, my voice trembling as I took a shaky step back. "You don't have to say anything," he murmured, stepping closer, his presence filling the space like a quiet storm. His gaze dropped to my lips, the unspoken longing in his eyes mirroring the chaos within me. "Just let this happen." His hand reached out, cupping my cheek with a gentleness that sent shivers coursing down my spine. His thumb traced the curve of my jawline, a touch so tender and deliberate that it made my defenses crumble. Against all logic, all restraint, I closed my eyes, surrendering to the moment. It felt like time slowed. Every heartbeat, every flicker of movement magnified. Years of unacknowledged longing surged forward, breaking free from the prison of denial I had built for myself. Guilt and fear lingered at the edges of my mind, whispering warnings, but they were no match for the tidal wave of desire that now consumed me. When I opened my eyes, his were waiting for me, intense and searching. Without a word, his hand slid to the back of my neck, his fingers tangling in my hair as he drew me closer. "Clara," he breathed my name, the sound of it igniting something deep inside me. His gaze dropped again to my lips, and this time, the tension between us was a force too powerful to resist. I didn't pull away. I couldn't. Instead, I leaned in, and the distance between us disappeared. His lips met mine in a kiss that was equal parts tender and desperate, a collision of all the emotions we'd both tried so hard to suppress. The world outside that small bathroom ceased to exist. There was no past, no future, only this moment. The kiss deepened, his arms wrapping around me and pulling me against him. His body felt strong and warm, molding perfectly to mine as though it had been meant to. My hands moved instinctively, tangling in his hair, holding him closer. The intoxicating scent of his cologne mingled with the faint metallic tang of the bathroom, a combination that only heightened the surreal intensity of the moment. When he pulled back slightly, his forehead resting against mine, his breathing uneven, his eyes held a mixture of determination and vulnerability. "I don't know if we can do this," I whispered, my voice breaking under the weight of my emotions. "I know," he murmured, his hands still cradling my face. "But it feels so right." He leaned in again, his lips brushing against mine, seeking permission. I didn't hesitate this time. I met him halfway, the longing within me eclipsing everything else. His hands moved lower, tracing the curve of my neck and sliding to my collarbone. Every touch sent a shiver through me, each caress igniting sparks of anticipation that burned hotter with every passing second. His lips trailed along my neck, his breath warm against my skin as he whispered, "You're driving me crazy." The confession was both exhilarating and terrifying, a mix of raw honesty and irresistible desire. My breath hitched as his tongue traced a slow, tantalizing path to my ear. And then a knock. The sound was sharp, insistent, and utterly jarring. It cut through the intimacy of the moment like a blade, dragging us back to reality with a force that made my heart race for entirely different reasons. The knock came again, louder this time, shattering the spell we had woven around ourselves. My chest tightened as the weight of what we were doing crashed down on me like a tidal wave. What was I doing? What if it was my husband? I pulled back abruptly, my heart hammering in my chest. Richard stepped away as well, tension rippling through his frame. His eyes darted toward the door, apprehension and frustration warring on his face. Who could that be? I stammered, my voice barely audible over the pounding of my pulse. I don't know, he said, his voice low and taut. Maybe it's just a neighbor. A shiver of dread coursed through me as I moved toward the door, every step feeling heavier than the last. My mind raced with worst-case scenarios. What if someone had seen us? What if it was someone who knew me, someone who knew Arthur? Just a minute. Richard called out, his voice firm but tense. Taking a deep breath, he opened the door. Relief washed over me when I saw who it was, Mrs. Henderson from down the hall. Her face was drawn with concern, her sharp eyes scanning the room. "Richard, dear," she said, her tone laced with worry. "I saw your light on, and I thought something might be wrong. I heard a noise earlier and—" Her voice trailed off as her gaze landed on me. Her eyes widened slightly, and her expression shifted to one of thinly veiled suspicion. "Oh," she said, her voice slow and deliberate. "I didn't realize you had company." I forced a smile, my heart pounding as I scrambled for an explanation. "Just helping Richard with a plumbing issue," I said, the words tasting bitter on my tongue. Her eyebrow arched, her skepticism palpable. "Plumbing issue," she echoed, the doubt in her voice cutting through the air like a knife. "Everything's fine, Mrs. Henderson," Richard interjected, his voice calm but clipped. "Thanks for checking in." She lingered for a moment, her gaze darting between us before she finally nodded. "Well, if you need anything, you know where to find me." With that, she turned and walked away, her footsteps echoing down the hall. Richard shut the door and leaned against it, exhaling a heavy breath. "That was too close," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Too close," I echoed, my own voice trembling. The tension between us, though momentarily diffused, was still there, simmering just beneath the surface. But now it was laced with unease, the weight of our near discovery pressing down on us both. "I think," Richard began, his voice faltering as he finally met my gaze, "I think you should probably go." The words hit me like a physical blow, sharp and cutting. I nodded slowly, my throat tightening. "Yeah," I said, barely managing to get the word out. The silence between us was heavy as I turned and walked toward the door. But as I reached the threshold, I paused, looking back at him. His eyes met mine, still filled with longing but now shadowed by a resignation that twisted something deep inside me. "I don't know what happens next," he admitted, his voice low and filled with quiet despair. "But we'll see." I nodded, my chest aching as I stepped out into the hallway. The cool night air greeted me as I made my way back home, my mind racing with what had just happened and what might still be to come. The pull between us wasn't gone. It was still there, strong and undeniable. And as I stepped into the suffocating quiet of my house, I knew one thing for sure. This wasn't the end. Not even close. I stood at the door, my hand trembling as it rested on the knob. My thoughts were scattered, a whirlwind of emotions battling for control. My heart pounded as if trying to warn me against stepping into the unknown. This night had brought more questions than answers, leaving me teetering on the edge of a decision that could change everything. When Richard opened the door, his eyes met mine, filled with a mix of longing and quiet uncertainty. He didn't speak right away, but his expression carried the weight of everything unspoken between us. "Are you sure you want to come in?" he asked softly, his voice steady but cautious. I hesitated, the gravity of his words pulling me back to reality. The small apartment, once just a neighborly refuge, now felt like a crossroads. It wasn't about tools or broken sinks anymore. It was about emotions neither of us had fully acknowledged until now. I started but trailed off, unable to find the right words. My pulse quickened as I took a deep breath, my thoughts tangled in the tension of the moment. "I think we need to talk." Richard stepped aside, silently inviting me in. The door clicked shut behind me, and the sound echoed in the quiet room. The atmosphere felt charged, the unspoken tension lingering in the air. I moved to sit on the edge of the couch, my hands clasped tightly together as I tried to steady my breathing. Richard sat across from me, his gaze fixed on mine, waiting. "I don't know how we got here," I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. "But this, whatever this is, we can't let it go any further." Richard's shoulders tensed, and he leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "I know," he said, his voice low. "But I can't deny how I feel. Can you?" His words hit me like a jolt, forcing me to confront the truth I had been trying to avoid. I couldn't deny the connection, the comfort I had found in his presence, the spark that had reignited something I thought I'd lost long ago. But the weight of reality bore down on me, reminding me of the lines we couldn't cross. "We've both been lonely," I said, meeting his gaze. "And maybe that's why this feels so intense. But it's not fair to either of us to pretend this can go somewhere it can't." Richard's expression softened, the vulnerability in his eyes mirroring my own. "You're right," he said after a long pause. "It's complicated. But that doesn't mean it wasn't real." The silence that followed was thick with shared understanding. I stood, the heaviness of the moment pressing on my chest. "I think I should go," I said softly, my voice steady despite the ache in my heart. Richard nodded, rising to his feet. "I get it," he said, his voice filled with a quiet resignation. "Just know, you've made a difference for me. More than you realize." I didn't trust myself to respond, so I gave him a faint smile before turning toward the door. As I stepped out into the crisp night air, the chill wrapped around me, grounding me in reality. The streets were quiet, the city lights casting long shadows as I walked home. Inside my house, the silence was almost deafening. I sank into the couch, staring blankly at the muted glow of the TV. My mind replayed the evening, the raw honesty of our conversation, the emotions we had finally confronted, and the realization that some connections, no matter how powerful, are best left untouched. In the days that followed, I avoided Richard, not out of anger or regret, but out of the need to regain clarity. I threw myself into my routines, focusing on the things that grounded me, my family, my work, the small rituals that made up my days. The tension that had once consumed me began to fade, replaced by a quiet acceptance. Sometimes, the most significant choices are the ones we don't make, the paths we choose not to walk. And as time passed, I realized that the night with Richard, as fleeting and intense as it was, had taught me something invaluable, the importance of boundaries, of understanding my own emotions, and of finding strength in the decisions that protect what truly matters. The chapter had closed, but it left a mark, a reminder of the fragility of human connections and the resilience it takes to honor them. And though the story was far from forgotten, I knew it was exactly where it needed to stay, in the past, a memory that shaped me, but no longer defined me.